Well, good morning. Hey, it is holiday season, isn't it, right? We got Halloween coming, Thanksgiving just around the corner. Everyone already got your plans, making your turkeys already? No? I don't know how that works, actually. And then Christmas right after that. But hey, we are starting this brand new series, and I just want to say thank you for joining us today, because this series, Holiday on its Head, is we are going to dive through, and we're going to study one of the most famous sermons ever written. It was actually a sermon given by Jesus himself with a Sermon on the Mount found in Matthew. And as we've been kind of preparing for this, we see that this sermon, it opens up and begins what is called with the Beatitudes. And you see this word beatitude is actually taken from a Latin word that means happy or blessed. In the original language, and as we're going to read today, where Jesus says, blessed is this, blessed is this, blessed, and he throws this down, it actually comes from this Greek word called Cyprus. And Cyprus was actually a place, too. It was an island, and it's known as Happy, or the Happy Island, right? I think that's been moved to Hawaii, or the Happy Islands right now. But in this time, Jesus is going to lay down and talk about what it looks like to have this blessed life. Well, as I was preparing for this, and I've been studying this text over the past few months and reading commentaries and go through, this is how kind of my preparation has, as I study God's word and the text and talk in our pastoral teaching team about going through it, and then we study culture. So we first say, what does the Bible say? What is the truth that comes out of it? And then we look at culture and says, how does this speak into and reveal the holes, reveal the lives we have in our lives? So in order to get a little more in tune with culture, I decided, why don't I start searching some hashtag blessed little forums and see how it goes? So I got on Instagram, I got on Twitter, that didn't last long. I got on Facebook and not TikTok, because I'm really not cool enough for that. But I started looking and searching of hashtag blessed. Found a lot of selfie pictures, like, my hair looks fantastic today, hashtag blessed. I'm like, you spent 2 hours on that. That did not happen when you woke up, let's just be real. Or like, look at my dog, it's so cute, hashtag blessed. Or, hey, my children are so nice, they're the perfect little angels, even though one punched each other in the face right before that. We all know that's true. Or like, hey, look at all this, like, I just spent money on this because my job's so awesome, I got money rolling in, hashtag blessed. But if we're being real, and there's a lot of posts out there, there's a lot of filters you can say, there's a lot of appearance we can put out there, that 2020 hasn't really been a hashtag blessed year. And for many, it's been a year of struggle, both on a large scale and a small scale. A year of frustration, a year of anger, a year of like, what in the world is going on? And maybe the worst part of all is it's the year of the most annoying political ads ever. Can I get an amen? I don't even know if I care who wins at this point. I'm just praying for the ads to stop, okay? No matter who wins, Jesus is still on his throne, okay? So we know we're going to be okay. But the ads, they just really need to stop. And I'm a believer, and I've already voted. I'm saving my sticker for Election Day, so people think I'm a good American. But I've already voted, and I'm like, the world, social media, they know everything about me, so they should know that I've already voted, so I should stop seeing the ads, right? That's how I think it should go. But I say all this because our world will put on this perception of we have this blessed life. We have it all figured out. And even when things aren't as crazy as 2020, if we're being honest, that is a facade. That is just a perception we're putting out there, like everything is fine, that I'm happy, I'm fulfilled, when there's something deeper missing in our life. Well, in this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to challenge us to do something that doesn't come natural. He's going to challenge our cultural ideals, and he's going to flip them on their head. And I want to start this morning is giving you a key thought as we dive into these passages and we dive into what this blessed life looks like. And here's where it starts, that a blessed life often looks like a messed up life. I don't know about you, but I'm all for blessings, but I don't really like the mess that sometimes come with it. And when I was thinking about this and writing it, I thought about my kids. And children are a blessing. The Bible even tells us children are a blessing. They're like arrows to put in your satchel or whatever you put arrows in. And then it said, blessed is the man who fills, and then you shoot them out to the world or something like that. But children are a blessing, but they're also a mess. They make your life a little harder. It's a little inconvenient sometimes. They're little jerks at times, like I like to say. But of all the blessings that come with children, a lot of hardships happen too. And so often in our lives, we want to take the easy route. We want our kids to be little saints without disciplining them in the hard ways into it. We want a great job and a great career that we're set up for, but don't want to put the hours in the hard work that it takes to get there. We want a Hallmark marriage without sacrificing our time and energy. So this morning, let's see how Jesus challenges our worldview of what a blessed life truly looks like. If you have a Bible, go ahead and flip to Matthew chapter 5. And if you don't have one, you can grab one in the chair in front of you, or you can find all these notes on the YouVersion Bible app if you search Cross Church Phoenix, and you can pull them up. But in Matthew chapter 5, as you are flipping there, let me give you a little background on this passage, because we're going to take the next 2 months going through kind of Matthew 5 through 7. And before we do that, we need to look a little bit more holistically at the book of Matthew. First, it is called the book of Matthew because the author that it was written by was one of the 12 disciples. He was a tax collector named Matthew. And a little background on him is he actually wrote this book, and it's one of the 4 Gospels. The Gospels are what tell the life of Jesus here on earth. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, of all those books, is primarily written to a Jewish audience. And you see why this is so important, because the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 1, it starts out and lays out this genealogy, meaning like this guy was born by him, and it goes through like a family tree. And there's some stalwarts of the Old Testament in there. It names Abraham and Moses and David. And the reason Matthew writes this, because then he ends up at Jesus, was to show that Jesus was from a royal line. Was to show that Jesus was the king of the Jews. And he starts his book in Matthew 1 like this. But by the time we get to Matthew 28, and it's read about the life of Jesus, how he lived, he taught, and we're going to see some of his teachings here. He lived a perfect life. He died on the cross, but then he didn't stay dead, but was raised again. Matthew presents him not just as king of the Jews, but as king of the entire universe. And you see, this is an important thing that we need to take into account, because Matthew, as he was writing to his audience, the first audience that would read this, as he writes this, that we read it today, is he's saying that Jesus is bigger than just us. That Jesus is bigger than our family. He's bigger than our community, than our state, than our nation, than even our Western civilization. Jesus is bigger than our entire planet, because he is the authoritative king over all of creation. Let's check out a little preview of that in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 1. This is what it says. When he, this is talking about Jesus, it says, when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying. Now let me stop right there, because I think before we dive into what we're going to talk about in this blessed life and what that looks like and the blessings that flow from here, we need to kind of establish a foundational truth. And it's this, that blessings can only come from a source of power and authority. When I was growing up, there was a comedian I used to listen to, and I'm not going to name him because he's probably not appropriate at all times. But this comedian, I will still remember how this joke that stuck in my head, and actually was reminded of this last week, that he talks about he's like in a mall or shopping mall or something like that, and a guy sneezes, and he says, "God bless you." And the response the guy says is, "Well, I'm an atheist." And then the comedian goes on, "Well, what do you want me to say? Like, I'm not God. I can't bless you. I don't have that power to bless you and make sure you have a good life after death." So then he walks through and spends 10 minutes talking and milking this joke as long as he can. And then at the end, the guy sneezes again and he says, "Nothing happens when you die." And that was kind of the punchline, and they move on. But the point of this is that only through power and authority can we bless. I think of when a woman is to go be married, and the tradition is that a man asks, before he asks a woman for her hand and to be engaged, he goes and asks the dad, "Can I marry your daughter?" And the dad gives permission. And the reason that is because there's some authority in the life of that daughter that father has. And you see here, as we're going to dive into this and we're going to talk about the blessings that flow from this, it's important to understand that we can only get certain blessings that have to come from power and authority. And you see, when we jump into this story, the audience that Jesus is about to talk to and preach to, they would have firmly believed that in this time, that only by the power of God could they truly experience blessing? And could they truly experience greatness in their lives? But you see, the thing about God's power is he often gave authority to men and women throughout Scripture to speak on his behalf, to perform signs and miracles on his behalf. That's what we see throughout Scripture, where God is speaking through people. And what Matthew shows us in this Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus has all the authority of a powerful God. You see, we see this in a couple ways. One, that Jesus' authority is shown is that he goes up on a mountainside. Now, there's two kind of key components to this. One is from a practical standpoint. This was in a day before microphones, 2,000 years ago. It was a long time ago. So practically and acoustically, when Jesus went up on a mountainside, he talked down into a valley or down the mountain so that large crowds could hear him speaking and he's not screaming the entire time. But the second point, and this was kind of important because we actually just looked at this recently, is this also hints to the Old Testament and to the story of Mount Sinai. Last week we wrapped up our series, Together is Better, and we looked about worship. And in the passage we looked was Exodus 19 and 20. And in that passage it talks about the nation of Israel coming to this mountain. In Moses, he goes up to the mountain and he kind of plays telephone with God and the people. And finally he comes down and he brings the 10 Commandments and he brings the law. And God was kind of speaking through Moses. He was giving authority to Moses to speak on his behalf. And here, Matthew is presenting Jesus in the same way. Because not only was Moses a lawgiver, but when we see this in Jesus, we see that Jesus is the greater Moses. He's not just a lawgiver, but he is the perfect lawgiver. And he is the perfect one who to present him as the king of the universe and the ultimate authority in our lives. Here's why I say all this, because too often we look in our lives for blessing to come from some sort of source. We look to our jobs, we look to our families, and we even look to entertainment. But let me blow up your mind for a second here. Netflix is not going to be your way to a blessed life. Man, you can binge watch a lot of TV and get through quarantine. But at the end of it, all you did is watch a lot of TV. And trust me, I'm just as guilty as anyone. But all of a sudden, our life's not better. Our life's not more blessed. Entertainment and sports is not going to give us a blessed life. Now, some of these things can give us momentary happiness, like when the Cardinals beat down the Cowboys last Monday night. Yeah, and hopefully will this Sunday night against the Seahawks. And if they don't, Matt, we're not speaking for a while. I'll be a little bit bitter. There was someone singing on here with Seahawks shoes this morning. I don't know how that happened. Almost went and painted some red over them. But even when we get into the more important stuff, when we get into our family and our careers, we will look for them to bless us, to fill our lives, but they don't have the power and the authority to do that. So this morning, let's take some time and let's look to the ultimate authority on here. And I'm going to give you 3 steps to living a blessed life. And you're like, man, that sounds like a little bit of a Joel Osteen sermon right now, but I promise we're not going there. We're coming from Jesus. But we're going to see 3 steps to living a blessed life and how Jesus, the ultimate authority, is going to be the guide on that. Let's pick up in verse 3. It says this, that blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. Now let's going to stop right there, because I think this is kind of where we group our first step in here that Jesus kind of lays out. And here's step 1 of living a blessed life, is that rock bottom is the perfect place to start. Let me have these ideas and what he says here sink in a little bit. Listen to these words he uses. He says, the poor in spirit, those who mourn, and those who are humble. Now you see, Jesus didn't say anything here, blessed are the rich, blessed are the emotionally strong, blessed are the super confident, the arrogant, the powerful, the well-off in our society, the ones who have a high place. Jesus didn't say any of that. And all those positions is what would society then and even now hold in high esteem. Instead, Jesus points to lowly qualities. The qualities at this time would be despised. And if we're being honest, even the qualities in our day are like, I don't know about that. Because here's another way to translate what he's saying there. Is he saying we need to take joy in our spiritual failure. If we're poor in spirit, that means we're not doing something right. And what Jesus is saying there is he's saying you need to take joy in the fact that you have failed spiritually, and by yourself you cannot get there. But then when he continues, he says, are those who mourn, is saying take joy in the fact that you are broken. You see, you don't cry when things are great. You don't mourn when everything is fine. You mourn when life breaks. When things are not good, when things are hard. And Jesus is saying, take joy in that brokenness. And lastly, he gets into this humility where I think Jesus is telling us to take joy in your dependence. You see, we talked about humility a few weeks ago, and humility isn't necessarily seeing just a low view of ourselves, but it's seeing the importance and the value in others. And when he's talking about this, right after this kind of idea of taking joy in your brokenness and taking joy in your spiritual poverty, this is leading into the fact that we need to take joy that we are dependent on God and not just ourselves. And here's the deal. Jesus says all this because he's kind of bringing our standpoint down. He's showing where we stand. As I was praying about this week, I kind of got this illustration that popped in my head. And if in Arizona, we're known as the Valley of the Sun, and people just think of us as a desert, but being in a valley, that means that there are higher things that surround us, right? That's what a valley looks like. There, I gave a science lesson. So we are full in the valley in Phoenix of beautiful mountains. And you can go climb a lot of mountains. I encourage you to do it now. It's going to be really nice this week. Go climb a mountain, right? Go hike somewhere. But here's the funny thing about when you talk about heights and talk about mountains and things like that. If you stand at the top of a mountain, do you know where the first place your eyes are going to be drawn to? They're going to look down. Because you're at a high place, it's just like when you're in a plane, you want to look down. And you want to see, you're like, man, I'm really high. I want to see what's down there. And your eyes are going to naturally draw there because of how high up you are. But here's the thing, when you're at the bottom of a mountain and you're staring at it, you're not looking down, you're not even looking at the middle of the mountain, your eye is going to be drawn to the peak because you realize how far you have to go. And you see, Jesus spiritually is doing the same thing with us here. And here's a trap we fall into, especially as Americans, is because when you talk about materially and socially, even politically, we are at a lot higher point of a mountain than most of our world and most of history. But spiritually, man, we're at rock bottom. And what Jesus is telling us is when we realize we are at rock bottom, when we realize spiritually we don't have the answers to everything, that we don't have the fulfillment and the joy by ourselves that we can have, then we will look to God for those answers. Romans 5:8 tells us this exactly, that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You see, this is the basic component to what we talk about a life with Jesus, about the gospel. The good news is we have to realize our brokenness. We have to realize that we don't have all the answers and realize that there's someone else who does. Now, we say that all the time, but the question is, do we actually believe that? Do we truly believe that we are broken? Do we truly believe we are at rock bottom? Because a lot of times we lie to ourselves and we think we're higher up on the mountain than we really are. And Jesus gives us a kick and then we fall down the mountain, but I think he catches us at the bottom. And he shows us that we need to, get a little reality check and see where we truly are. But then I want to bring you back into the story again for a second and think about the imagery as Jesus is teaching this. He's sitting on top of a mountainside, and everyone else is below him. Because if they're behind him, they're not going to hear what he's teaching. Again, there's no microphones. That's not how the acoustics work. So everyone would be lower than him. Now, the disciples, they might be a little higher on the mountain, but everyone's still down below, and they're looking up to Jesus Christ as he's giving this message. Step 1 is that rock bottom is the perfect place to start. Step 2 is that full surrender is the perfect way to grow. Let's keep reading in verse 6. Jesus continues, and he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." You see, the next logical step when we realize that we can't bless ourselves, that we are spiritually bankrupt, when we are at rock bottom, is we surrender to the right power and to the right authority. Now, when I say surrender, maybe the first thing that probably pops into your mind is a white flag, right? Like when I think of surrender, I think of white flags. I think of history class and studying about the French, right? France surrendered a lot. History joke, nobody got it. Yeah, they did. It was just true. Maybe that's our bias. But anyway, so when I think about that, I think of surrendering and saying, waving the right flag. But here's, I think, how we can describe surrender. Surrender can be described as recognizing that the consequences of continuing are worse than the consequences of stopping. Let me say that again. Surrendering is saying that the consequences of continuing on in the same path are worse than the consequences of stopping right now. Think about this for an example in a war setting. When one country says, I surrender, and says, we're going to stop this war, what they are saying is they've weighed the costs, and they're saying in order to save lives that I'm going to do jail time, I'm going to pay penalties, whatever that looks like, but we're going to stop this because we project that we're going to end this war, and we're going to lose more if we continue. And you see, spiritually, we must come to the same point, where we recognize that our current sin has worse consequences than fully surrendering to our God. Now, when we hear that word surrender, we probably don't like it, because that means giving up control. That means not being the driver in the car. But just as Jesus is flipping the ideals of the world on its head, he does the same thing with this idea of surrender. Because you see, when we surrender to God, it doesn't limit our freedom, but it only increases it. Let's look a little more closely at some of these verses. You see, when we surrender to God, I think he's telling us we can take joy in our hunger. When we surrender to God, that we can take joy in our inconvenience. He said, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. It's not easy to be merciful. That takes some time. That's inconvenient. That allows us to step out of our lane and have to help someone and show mercy to someone else. And then he's saying, take joy in our prudence. That's what it means to be pure in our hearts. And all of these things don't seem good on the surface, but let's see how Jesus makes them so attractive. First, let's start with hunger. And I don't know about you, where he says, blessed are those hunger and thirst. I am one that does not like to be hungry or thirsty. Right? Like if I'm hungry, I'm going to go eat. Or if I'm bored, I go eat. Like my wife the kids went to bed yesterday, and I was watching football on the couch, and I even ate lunch, but I probably didn't eat enough lunch. So I just constantly found myself getting up off the couch and going and trying to find things to eat. And we didn't have what I wanted to eat, so then I started eating my wife's dessert, and she somehow caught me at night. She's like, did you eat one of these? I was like, how did you know? Are you counting? I bet. And yes, she was. But when we hear hungry, we think that's kind of a bad thing. Well, actually, I saw a great example of this week, is there was a tweet that someone put out, and they said, would you take, if you were given $50 million, the offer of $50 million, would you take it with the condition you cannot make a contribution? What does that mean? You can't work, you can't do community service, you can't make any meaningful contribution to society or to someone around you. Everything has to be used self-serving and only serving yourself. Now you're like, $50 million, that sounds great. Like I'm struggling to pay my mortgage and my rent, like $50 million, I'd be set. But think how boring that would be. Because you see, God didn't create us that way. He didn't create us to watch Netflix all day. And that's why the NFL is only on Sunday and sometimes Monday and Thursday. We need, it's not 7 days a week. There's reasons we can't just sit there and do nothing, because God has an innate hunger within us that strives to do more, that strives to seek more. And what Jesus is saying is that hunger can be something bad. When we give it over to our flesh and to our sin, it can lead to destructive lifestyles that hurts ourselves and those around us. But when it's given to the right reason, when we hunger and thirst for righteousness, beautiful things can happen in fully surrendering to God. But here's the deal. To fully surrender and to grow in God in our spiritual life, it requires us to constantly look inward at our hearts. It constantly allows us to evaluate, what do we desire? What do we long for? What do we want? That's when he's saying, are we pure in heart? One of the big things that God has kind of placed on my heart in this past year is, how am I getting better in my leadership and in my spiritual walk in these different areas of my life? And I've been kind of going along and felt happy in some areas that I'm like, okay, I'm taking some steps forward. But God put more of a burden on it. He's like, how are you working forward on stuff? So one of the things that I felt convicted of is I need coaches in my life. People who are ahead of me on the game, people who can speak into me, who are smarter than me, who have done more, who are more spiritual than me, whatever that looks like, and attack with. So first, I got a leadership coach. And there's a guy that I call or Zoom with probably once a month, and sometimes I don't know how this guy gives me the time of day, but he's a super smart guy helping churches all over the nation. And I said hey man, here's what's on my heart, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm reading, what do you think about it? And then he just pours into me in wisdom. And then recently God's okay, you're doing good at that. But this was one of the things he talked about. He's now you need a spiritual coach. You need someone to come alongside you and show some maybe holes or gaps in your life and in your life with Christ of how can you see that? Because sometimes we don't see these things on our own. We try to look inward at our heart and we're yeah, things are all right. But it's when we come to someone else. In this meeting I've been having with these guys, I'm hey, I'm not feel like I can trust God in these areas. Why is that? Or why am I not celebrating the success of this happening? And sometimes we need other people to look from the outside who are godly people in our lives that can say, yeah, something's wrong with that. But here's what God says, and here's how we can move forward. You see, when we truly do this, when we look inward at our heart, it can change everything. Step 1 is look upward to God. Know that we are at rock bottom. Step 2 is to look inward at our heart to fully surrender in order to grow closer to Him, which brings us to step 3, that abundant compassion is the perfect way to live. Let's keep reading in verse 9. It said, blessed are the peacemakers. And you've probably heard this before. It is a famous line that has been used by politicians, has been used throughout history. But he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And it continues in verse 11, you are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. He says, be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven, for that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You see, Jesus here talks about peacemaking and persecution. And maybe when you first hear those words, you don't know or think that compassion is kind of the theme of these, but let me break this down a little more. First, he addresses peace. Now, when we talk about peacemaking, you can't be a peacemaker or you can't make peace if first there is not division. Jesus here is telling us that we need to take joy when there is division in our world and division in our lives. You see, because when there is division, there is full of right now, there becomes opportunity for peace. I think if we look at social media, if we look at our work relationships, if we even look at our own families, we see that division is a common theme right now. People are divided over politics, over social movements, over just the craziest of things, over how do we react in a pandemic. There is so much division that's happening right now. But Jesus is saying, hey, be scared about that, run from that. Instead, he says, step in and be a peacemaker. And you see a peacemaker, he says they are called the sons of God. This doesn't make us a son of God. Rather, it exhibits the quality that God is for. You see, we can make peace because God first made peace with us when he sent Jesus Christ to bring us back to him. And peacemaking requires us to have compassion. You know why that is? Because sometimes peacemaking isn't about being right, but about loving the other person. I don't know about you, but that one convicts me hard. Because don't go ask my wife, but I like to be right sometimes. And sometimes I get an argument, and Google makes this even worse, because then I Google it, and I try to find if I am right, so then I can show them, yeah, I told you I was. And then if I find out I'm wrong, I just hope they never bring it up again, and I'm like, yeah, that didn't happen. They're like, hey, did you ever look that up? No, I couldn't find it. It was just gone. It's not on the internet somewhere. But peacemaking makes us check our ego at the door. It makes us care more about the other person than about maybe being right or ideology in that standpoint, which leads to this next point of how do we better love those around us? We be a peacemaker, but it also leads to the fact that then we need to take joy when the persecution comes. Now this one is a little more difficult. And not only are we not arguing and getting to be right with those around us, but now sometimes we'll be persecuted or treated unfairly because of it. And some of us, it's well, that's where we draw the line. I'll be gracious, I'll be nice, it's okay that I'm not right, but now I'm being treated or I'm being persecuted because of it? Nah, man, I'm not good with that. But here is why this is something that Jesus says we should take joy in. And is something that we should be glad for. Because if you are being persecuted because of your faith, because of loving your neighbor, then that means you're doing something right. Because he said, blessed are the ones who are persecuted because the prophets were persecuted before them. Jesus himself was persecuted. The early church in Acts and beyond was persecuted. If we're not being persecuted, sometimes it means that we're not doing anything right and that it's okay to be ignored and left alone. You see, when our faith looks outward towards loving and sharing Jesus with other people, we will see things happen. But you may wonder, like, that all sounds like good stuff. Like what we talk about here at Cross Church all the time is our mission is to make Jesus known, and we want to do that by caring and loving for our community. You're like, none of that sounds bad. None of that sounds like something people would get mad about or get angry about. Why would they persecute us for loving our neighbor? Well, John Piper puts it this way, and he talks about when we live a spiritual life, when we live a life directed towards following Jesus, it will change some of our lifestyle, which sometimes will be kind of thrown in the face of the world. Here's how he says it, that if you cherish moral purity, your life will be an attack on people's love for unbridled sex. If you embrace temperance, your life will be a statement against the love and abuse of alcohol and drugs. If you pursue self-control, your life will indict excessive eating. Now, am I saying we need to go indict and say people are wrong? Absolutely not. But if your life is living this way, naturally people will be offended by it. He goes on, he says, if you live simply and happily, you will show the folly of luxury. If you walk humbly with your God, you will expose the evil of pride. If you are punctual and thorough in your dealings, you will lay open the inferiority of laziness and negligence. He said, if you speak with compassion, you will throw callousness and jerkiness, I added that one, into sharp relief. John Piper doesn't say jerkiness, I'm pretty sure. And then he ends with this, if you are spiritually minded, you will expose the world-mindedness of those around you. You see, when we live a compassionate lifestyle, focused outward to those around us, it will both ruffle the feathers of both people in good and bad ways. It will bring some people to be closer and become friends with God, friends with us, and it will push people to be farther and greater enemies of God. Now, as we wrap this up today, and we kind of bring to a close everything we've talked about, and this has been a big passage we've kind of broken off today. Let me summarize it, what we've talked about today in this way. And here's the bottom line, is moving forward to a blessed life requires us to look upward to Jesus, inward at our heart, and outward towards others. You see, if we want to move forward, we got to look upward, inward, and outward. And it's not just about keeping our eyes, thinking we have it all set, thinking we can do this on our own, but it requires us to move forward, to look to how can Jesus bless my life. It's not by my own ability, but first it starts with falling on our knees, of looking where we're truly at, and then living on mission for others. And see how Jesus kind of talks about how this is played out. Matthew chapter 5, and this is what we're going to close out with this verse, is in 13. He says this, Matthew 5:13, he says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Verse 14, he says, you are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand. And it gives light for all those who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so they may see your good works and give glory to your God in heaven. Jesus here is telling us that if you want to be salty, not in the mean way, but in a spiritual way, we got to look to the supplier of the salt. And we can't supply that salt. It is only through our God, Jesus Christ. And every now and then, we got to re-examine our hearts. We got to see, well, am I really doing this? Am I producing this? Does my life show this? Or have I lost my saltiness? Have I lost my faith towards God? Am I really fully surrendering to Him? Or is there some part of my heart I'm holding back? And when we do that, we can be that city situated on a hill, giving light to the community around us. Is it going to be easy? No. Living a blessed life is often messy. Living a blessed life also gets opposition and often gets persecution. But Jesus says when we follow this life, we will truly be filled. and we will truly understand what blessing looks like in a way that our world can never provide. Let's pray.